Haiti and the rice industry, a story of economic warfare. In the early 1980s, Haiti was a nation of proud farmers. Among them were thousands of rice farmers in the fertile Artibonite Valley who had been cultivating rice for generations. Rice was a staple in the Haitian diet, and the country was largely self-sufficient, producing enough to feed its people. This was soon to change as global forces and foreign policies converged to reshape Haiti's economy. Haiti's troubles began in 1986 when the infamous Western puppet, President Jean-Claude Baby Doc Duvalier, was overthrown after 15 years in power. For decades, he and his father had fleeced the nation whilst brutalizing its people. So, with his departure, he left behind a nation politically unstable and economically vulnerable. Faced with a growing economic crisis, the interim government sought help from the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. The IMF and the World Bank, backed by the US and the other Western powers, offered financial aid to stabilize Haiti's economy. However, this aid came with strict conditions. Haiti was required to implement structural adjustment programs, SAPs, which were neoliberal economic reforms aimed at opening up the country to global trade and reducing government intervention in the economy. One of the key conditions of the SAPs was trade liberalization, a drastic reduction in tariffs, taxes on imports or exports of goods between countries, and import restrictions. Haiti's tariff on imported rice, which had previously been around 50%, was slashed to a mere 3%. This was meant to encourage so-called free trade and reduce food prices for urban consumers, but it would have devastating consequences for the rural economy. While Haiti was opening its markets to foreign corporations, the United States was heavily subsidizing its agricultural sector, including rice production. These subsidies allowed US farmers to produce rice at a much lower cost than Haitian farmers. Under the leadership of President Ronald Reagan and later President George H.W. Bush, the US continued to promote the theoretical benefits of free trade policies to Haiti while providing substantial financial support to American rice producers. In other words, in paying for the cost of production for its rice farmers, the US government was doing exactly what its agents in the IMF and World Bank had told Haiti it could not do if they wanted financial assistance. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, enormous quantities of cheap subsidized American rice, often referred to as Miami rice because much of it passed through the port of Miami, began flooding Haitian markets. Of course, American farmers could afford to sell for less, so imported US rice became far cheaper than locally grown rice, undercutting the prices that Haitian farmers could offer. In 1994, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who had been elected president in 1990 before being ousted in a US-orchestrated coup in 1991, returned to power with the sanction of the US after 3 years in exile. His return sparked hope among the Haitian people that economic reforms would focus on rebuilding local industries. However, by this time, the damage to Haiti's rice industry was largely irreversible. Aristide faced immense pressure to continue with the neoliberal policies initiated under the SAPs. The Haitian government did not restore protective tariffs on rice or reverse the economic liberalization that had already taken hold. As a result, local rice farmers continued to suffer, and Haiti grew increasingly dependent on rice imports from the US. Throughout the 1990s, Haiti's domestic rice production plummeted. Small-scale farmers who had once relied on rice as their main source of income were pushed out of business unable to compete with the low prices of imported rice. In the Artibonite Valley, once the heart of Haiti's rice industry, fields were abandoned and farmers were forced to turn to other less profitable crops or move to urban areas in search of work. By the early 2000s, Haiti had gone from being largely self-sufficient in rice production to importing more than 80% of its rice from the United States. The once thriving rice industry was decimated, and the country's dependence on imported food left it vulnerable to global price fluctuations. In 2010, following the devastating earthquake that struck Haiti, former US President Bill Clinton, who had played a key role in pushing for neoliberal reforms during his presidency in the 1990s, publicly acknowledged the harm that US policies had caused to Haiti's rice industry. Clinton admitted that the promotion of cheap US rice imports had destroyed rice production in Haiti and contributed to the country's enduring poverty and food insecurity. He expressed regret for the policy decisions that, while supposedly intended to provide short-term relief for Haitian consumers, ultimately undermined the country's ability to feed itself. These were vain, empty words, however, as they were not followed by any form of reparatory justice or compensation to the farmers or the nation of Haiti. Instead, the US and its corporations continued to exploit Haiti as a source of cheap labor and resource extraction. Today, the Haitian people continue to resist the conditions of impoverishment that have been imposed upon them, while the nation's dependence on imported rice continues to affect its economy and food security. The intersection of US agricultural subsidies, neoliberal economic reforms, and international pressure from the IMF and the World Bank led to the collapse of Haiti's rice sector. Around the same time, Haiti's pig farming industry was also destroyed as a result of policies imposed by the US. The consequences of these decisions are still felt today, as Haiti struggles with poverty, food insecurity, and economic dependence. The story of Haiti's rice industry is a cautionary tale of how foreign economic policies, especially as dictated by neo-colonial institutions, can have devastating effects on local industries in vulnerable countries. The fight for food sovereignty continues. We stand with the people of Haiti.